G'day everyone, Kate Fantinel or Lady Liberty Australia here. I am here in Las Vegas at FreedomFest and I am sitting down with Dr. John Lott Jr. I've been following his work for a long time. He is a big researcher into guns, especially in America, but he's also looked at what happened in Australia too with our statistics. I caught your speech the other day and you were talking about the number of murders and the counties that they occur in America and how it's so small. Can you just give an overview of your speech that you gave about the statistics regarding guns and murders in America?
Right. Well, the United States is pretty unique in terms of how heavily concentrated murders are in very tiny areas. 2% of the counties in the United States account for 56% of the murders. And even within those counties, you have about 2/3 of their murders occur within 10-block areas. So, largely that's gangs, drug gangs, fighting against each other over drug turf, but it's very heavily concentrated. So, and those, ironically, are not the areas which have the highest gun ownership rates. You look around the rest of the country, about 54% of the counties have zero murders. Another 16% of the counties have only one murder each. So about 70% of the counties have either zero or one murder.
So in Australia, we get a lot of coverage in the media about America and its high gun crime rate and how we don't want to end up like you with all the gun deaths. Do you think that the media doesn't portray the statistics accurately and it's more shock journalism as part of a narrative to portray more guns as a problem?
Well, if you look across the country, the areas that have the lowest murder rates are the ones that have the highest gun ownership rates. But, much more important, we have a drug gang problem here in the United States. You look at a country like Mexico, less than 0.1% of the adult population in Mexico is legally licensed to own a gun. And yet in many recent years, Mexico's murder rate's been 6 times higher than the murder rate that we have in the United States. In fact, since 1972, there's only been one gun store in Mexico. The most powerful gun you've been able to legally buy in Mexico has been a .22 caliber short round bolt action rifle. That's not the type of gun that the drug cartels are using down there. But since they've had that rule, their murder rate's more than doubled. And as I say, in many recent years, it's been as high as 6 times higher than the murder rate in the U.S. So, the problem that you have is that drug gangs, drug cartels, bring in weapons to protect their property just as they bring in the drugs. It's not like a drug gang can go and say, look, this other gang stole our drugs, to the police, can you help us get them back? They have to set up their own little militaries in order to try to do that. And, in the United States, if I could click my fingers and cause all illegal drugs to disappear and all guns, how long do you think it would be before illegal drugs started coming back into the U.S.? If I live in El Paso, Texas, 20 minutes? And how long would it be before they'd bring in the weapons to protect that extremely valuable property that they have? They'd be bringing it in at the same time. And so, look, I'll give you probably the best response I can give to your point is that there are places around the world that have either tried to ban all guns or all handguns. Name me one place, any place in the world, that's banned either all guns or all handguns and seen murder rates go down or even stay the same. Every single time either all guns or all handguns have been banned, murder rates go up, and often by large amounts. Even in island nations, you see that occurring. So, you'd think out of randomness, once or twice, it would go down. And yet, the opposite's true. And basically what happens is when you pass bans, it's the most law-abiding good citizens who obey the rules, not the criminals. You may take a few guns away from the criminals, but if you're primarily disarming the would-be victims relative to the criminals, you actually make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes.
Now let's talk about Australia and 1996. There is a graph that is burnt into my brain that homicides were falling before the 1996 incident in Port Arthur and continued to fall afterwards. Now, yesterday when I spoke to you about that, you said that it would have continued to fall anyway, despite the new laws.
Right. Well, what what happens in the discussion about Australia is that they look at simple before and after averages, and that's can be very misleading. And the example I was giving you is, let's just say murders were falling all the time in a perfectly straight line. I could pick any point along that line, and the after average would be below the before average. But if I had a law that changed in the middle of a perfectly straight line, I would look at it and say, well, it's falling before, it's falling after. Is it obvious that it had any impact on anything? I'd want to see, did it fall more slowly? Did it fall faster? Was there some type of discontinuity that was occurring in the line there? And, if you look at Australia, basically for 15 years before the buyback that you had in 96 and 97, firearm homicides were falling, firearm suicides were falling. And in fact, if anything, the firearm homicide rate was falling more slowly for a while after the buyback than it was beforehand. But look, here's the issue, and that is, so they bought up almost 30% of the guns that people had and destroyed them. But people were allowed to go and buy guns again after that. And by 2010, the gun ownership rate in Australia was actually above what it was prior to the buyback. So if gun control advocates were right, you should have seen an immediate drop in crime. And then over time, as the gun ownership rate was increasing, you should see an increase that occurred. That's not what you see. It basically stopped falling and was relatively flat in terms of firearm murders for about 8 years afterwards. And so, but there was no sudden drop and an increase. So, the other thing would be, like for suicides, I would look at total suicides. Again, I mentioned around the world. You can look around the world, and you see after guns are banned, you may see a drop in firearm suicides, but you should look at total suicides, because there are many other ways that people can commit suicides. In Australia, if you look at total suicides actually increased after the buyback there. Now, I'm not going to go and say that the buyback caused total suicides to go up, but it surely didn't cause it to fall.
Yeah.
And so, but for some reason, nobody looks at total suicides when you're talking about the numbers down there.
Well, you inspired me to have a look at what's happening in my home state of Western Australia, because at the moment they are running another gun confiscation scheme. They have put limits on how many firearms we can own. We can only own up to 5, and we have to prove why we want to own each one. They are looking at our health records to see if we can be trusted as a fit and proper person, including mental health records. They are also looking at our social media to determine if our views, attitudes and opinions make us worthy of having a firearm. So Western Australia is currently having another gun confiscation program at the moment. So I went back and looked at the statistics from 2022. So for the total deaths and the homicide rate and how many firearms were used in those incidents. So we had in Western Australia, there were 377 suicides in 2022, and 19 of them were with firearms, which is 5%. In terms of homicide, there were 33, and the number of times firearms were used were 8. So we're looking at very, 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 very small. So 0.28.
Well, even the 8, I don't know. Were they who committed those murders? Yep. Were they gangs? Were they?
Well, the other interesting thing is in Australia, they don't count self-defense killings in the statistic. They don't, or police killings. We don't have a legal right to self-defense in Australia. We cannot use our firearms at all. We can't even use pepper spray or mace. So we don't have the right to self-defense. But with the WA homicide, so it's 0.2% per 100,000 were used for firearms, and for total all gun deaths, 0.96 per 100,000. But the government is using gun crime and public safety as an excuse to take away more firearms in a state that clearly doesn't have a firearms problem.
Right. Well, as I was saying, even those homicides that were there, how many of them were people who legally owned the gun or not? My guess is hardly any of them were probably people that legally owned the gun. So of the 8, maybe it's 0 that was there. That seems to me the more relevant question, because you're going to be basically law-abiding citizens. The ones who have registered their guns, the ones who own their guns, are the ones who are going to be affected by the change that's there. But look, if my research convinces me of anything, the people who benefit the most for owning guns are the most vulnerable people in our society. And there's 2 groups of people who I think benefit the most. One are people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. And the other group of people are basically poor, in the United States, poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. The people who are the most likely victims of violent crime. So you're almost always talking about a young male doing the crime. And when a man is attacking a woman, there's a much larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to go and protect herself than it does for a man.
Well, it's the equalizer.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so, the fact that you can't, pepper spray has its limitations. It's maybe better than nothing, but pepper spray, if it's windy or if it's raining or if you're in an enclosed space, the person who's using it's likely to be just as affected as the other person. If the wind is blowing towards you, you may be more affected than the person you're doing. Plus, pepper spray doesn't work on everybody, and it doesn't work instantly, okay? So, if it takes 20, 30 seconds for it to have an impact on somebody, a lot of harm can be done in that period of time. And so, but, the fact that they won't even let you use things like that, I assume a stun gun's out of the question. Yeah. But I don't know what one of the problems with stun guns is if somebody's wearing heavy clothing or if they have let's say rubberized shoes, then they don't have a connection to the ground, they're not grounded. You may not be able to it may not be useful there either. But also with stun, if you're going to use a handheld device, you have to be very close to somebody. And the problem again for women is that if they actually get into physical contact with the attacker, they've lost control of the situation usually. Yeah. So, in the United States, we have something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, which we've had for about 50 years. They survey 240,000 people each year. And they ask people if they've been victims of a crime, and then they ask about 40 different questions about things like where did the crime occur, when did it occur, what was involved, characteristics of the criminal, how you responded, what the final outcome was. And what you find is that, particularly for women, but this is true across all groups, by far the safest course of action for you to take when you're confronted by a criminal is to have a gun. Women who behave passively are 2.4 times more likely to end up being seriously injured than a woman who has a gun. You'll frequently hear this claim that passive behavior, which is pretty much what they're forcing you to do in Australia, it sounds like, is safer than active resistance. The problem is that's really statistical malpractice that they do that, because what they're doing is they compare passive behavior to all forms of active resistance lumped together. Some of those are much more dangerous than passive behavior. So, for example, for a woman, by far the most dangerous course of action for a woman to take when she's confronted by a criminal is to use her fist. When you're almost always talking about a man doing the attack, if you use your fist, you're going to get a physical response back. The second most dangerous course of action for a woman to take is to run away. Now, if you can run away and escape, that's great. But women tend to be significantly slower runners than men are. In the process of being tackled and subdued, there could be real serious injuries that can occur. So, you're lumping those things together with a gun, and it kind of, and some of these things like a stun gun or a mace, they're pretty much a wash. It doesn't, because there are limits to doing it, and so anyway,
Yeah.
it's just.
The other stat that I came across when I was looking this up is in terms of domestic violence. So the argument for the Western Australian government at the moment is that we have a domestic violence crisis in Australia. The government is blaming it on the behaviour of men. Interestingly, the domestic violence deaths in 2022 in Western Australia, of which there were 22, none of them used firearms.
Right.
But they're using that as an excuse to take away guns off of people.
Well, I would say it should be an excuse to let women have guns. The thing is, if you're talking about a man, he can pretty much kill a woman anyway without having to resort to a gun. But a woman has very limited ways to go and protect herself. If she wants to use a baseball bat, I don't know, maybe you have a cricket. There.
Yeah, cricket.
A cricket bat or something. You have to get pretty close to somebody, and they can grab it when you're swinging it and take it away from you, and you're in trouble because you're right there with them. So the whole benefit of having a gun, the vast majority of times that people use guns defensively, it's not necessary to fire a gun. About 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun is enough to cause a criminal to break off the attack. And so, but the whole benefit of having a gun is to try to keep the attacker away from you. Because, as I said before, if a woman actually gets into physical contact with the man, she's likely to lose.
Do you know the statistics of how many incidents of firearm use in America from a self-defense perspective? How many lives have been saved by the point of the person having a firearm? Is there statistics available on that? We obviously don't collect that in Australia because we can't have self-defense. But do you know, are there studies into that?
Well, we can talk about estimates of the number of defensive gun uses that occur. What would have been the outcome in terms of crime are going to be, a little bit more difficult to answer. But we're talking about something around 2 million times a year that Americans use guns defensively in order to stop crime. But if you're going to be talking about what happens to things like murders and what have you, we have a couple different types of pieces of evidence. One is just we've seen places in the United States, like Washington, D.C. and Chicago, that have banned handguns. We saw what happened with murder rates afterwards. There was large increases in murder rates. We have concealed carry in the United States. And we have about 22 million Americans that have a concealed carry permit. It varies a lot across states, but now we have 29 what we call constitutional carry states, where it's no longer even necessary to get a permit to be able to carry if you can legally own a gun, which basically means you don't have a violent criminal history, and if you haven't been committed to a mental health hospital, then you're allowed to be able to go and own a gun. And so you're talking about maybe 15% of the likely voters in the country either carry all or most of the time. And we can go and see what happens to crime rates when people are allowed to carry. And you see a very close relationship between the percent of the population with a permit and drops in violent crime rates. So, and it's particularly true for women. The benefit for women from getting an additional concealed carry permit is about 3 to 4 times larger than it is for men.
Well, if only we had the right in Australia to self-defense at the very least. If only we had a government that wasn't portraying this lie that more guns equals more crime. We are peaceful people, firearm owners. My dad was stripped of his guns in 1996, and that's what gave me the passion to follow this journey. Working for the Sporting Shooters for 5 years, I did a lot of research there, and everything you say is true. More guns does not equal more crime. Peaceful people are not the ones committing the crimes. It's usually drug wars. So I hope one day in Australia we see some sense. Will you be doing any studies into Australian gun crime and Australian gun ownership in the future?
I suppose it's always possible.
We need some more stats out there for us.
I mean, right now I've been helping out a lot with South American countries. Just last couple of weeks I've been in Chile and Brazil, and before that, earlier this year, I was in Ecuador for a while.
Yeah.
So I'm probably going to be going down to Argentina soon. So they've been
Malay country.
Yeah. Well, a lot of political changes occurring in South America in both directions, and so it's a hot topic down there. But Malay is a pretty libertarian guy, and he believes in the right to self-defense, and so we'll see what types of changes they're able to get through there. But they were talking about having me testify before their Senate. So we'll see what happens.
And you have testified in front of the Australian Senate before with Senator David Leyonhjelm on the gun violence inquiry. How did that go? Did you find Australians were listening to you, or were you shouting into the wind a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I accomplished, but it's just amazing how people have misstated the statistics there. As I say, just looking at simple before and averages, you would think people would kind of understand how misleading that can be. And I just, I gave you before the simple example. Let's say it was falling over the whole time. The lower after average is before, the before average is lower than the before average, but people understand intuitively that a perfectly straight line is not changing anything that's there. So you try to explain things like that, and, who knows. But try to make a difference.
Well, thank you for all your hard work. I've been following you for a long time, so I'm very honoured to be here sitting with you.
Well, thank you. Very
Doctor.
nice meeting you.
And please check out his research on, where's the website?
Crimeresearch.org.
Crimeresearch.org. Fantastic source of information.
Have some stuff on Australia there if you search under Australia.
Excellent.